finished on the glass half full point. But that's extremely helpful. I mean, it does feel, doesn't it, at times that one is sort of operating in a slight parallel universe where, on the one hand, we've got this incredible impatience around delivering against the development bottom line and the need to push forward on the MDGs and the need to, account for how external support is used in contributing to development in small, bite-sized chunks which tell a good story. And on the other hand, we have a lot of evidence at our fingertips, increasingly rich, increasingly in-depth, which kind of urges us to be patient, us to think very carefully about how we imagine the prospects for external assistance in the business of supporting long-term and sustainable development. And we think about the landscape of engagement as being much more patterned, much more varied, much richer perhaps than we might have done in the past. And those sometimes universes seem to absolutely be not speaking to one another. But where Sue ended up was a suggestion that there are bridges between them. And I think it's our, what we're discussing here in a part is how we firm up those bridges and perhaps build them and make them more robust. I'm going to open it up now to questions and observations and comments. I will do hopefully at least 2 rounds, and we may get 3 in if we've got the time. I'm going to start in the middle and then I'll move out to the side. So Sheila first.
Thank you. Thank you. On the David's point on the institutions, I think this is tremendously important, and I think it's a real pity that to celebrate the anniversary of DPR talking only about aid institutions. I spent a good part of yesterday evening reading about the importance of institutions in the trade response to the financial crisis, where many of the same points are being made, that one has to look at the institutions, how they exist, how they were used, and so on. And I think that broadening this debate out would be useful. Which brings me to Tim's paper. I much preferred Alison's phrasing of it to yours. It's informal versus formal more than old versus new, isn't it? I mean, to call the Malawian town chiefs traditional is stretching things rather a long way. They are no more traditional than Tammany Hall was in New York, and they're very similar. And I really would have liked to have seen more opening up beyond Africa in what you said. When you talked about the big man with technical advisors, I thought about the Populato in Mexico. These are where one can learn some things about Africa. It's not just about Africa and just about old things. And that brings me to Sue's point, which I very much agree, that trying to use these, you said, Tim, they were underutilized, may actually make things worse and may cause serious damage. Because where the informal and the formal sectors coexist, they do so, in a sense, across each other. They serve different purposes. We know that the informal sector is not quite as legitimate as the formal, even though we all use it and we all use our own networks, and it's not just in Africa that we use networks. But that crossness is part of the essence of development.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to take a cluster of things. Did you have a question? Oh, no, it was you, sorry. Beg your pardon. Do say who you are so that these people know who to respond to.
Will
Sheila,
do.
sorry.
That was Sheila Page, the previous editor of Development Policy Review.
Justin Thacker, Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health. Tim, I was very interested in what you were saying about religious institutions and the efficacy of aid, but I wondered perhaps if you're partly kind of overcomplicating, even over-spiritualizing what's going on. Certainly when I worked in a rural hospital in Kenya, the folks came to us, and this was a faith-based hospital I worked in, simply because they could trust us to deliver their healthcare rather than the state hospital down the road, where they were never quite sure what kind of healthcare they were actually going to receive. And so for a large section of the population that came to us, it wasn't for any spiritual reasons, it was simply that they trusted us. And you'll be well aware that there's evidence of a greater degree of trust in faith-based organizations than non-faith-based organizations in Africa. So I guess the point I was thinking really is that there's not just one grain, is there? There are actually multiple grains in Africa, and perhaps it's going with those multiple grains.
Thank you very much. Can you pass it in the front here, and then we'll go back to John? Yeah,
Hi, Elisa Kaczynska. I'm from London Met. I'm a lecturer in development. First of all, I wondered three very quick questions. Whether each of the speakers could
really
sorry.
short if you've got three, please.
It will be really short. Development. What's your definition of development, each one of you? Secondly, to Tim, Botswana is supposed to be one of those economic miracles. Did the president, first president of Botswana, Khan, did he? Do you think did he work with the grain? Or, on the contrary, did he actually succeed because he adopted liberal democratic institutions, Western liberal democratic institutions? And finally, the big men. What kind of checks and balances would we have on the big men so that they don't become dictators? Thank you.
Thank you. Right at the back there, John de John. There we go. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jonathan DeJohn from SOS. Couple questions for Tim and David. First is a semantic point. You made this dichotomy between developmental and predatory. I'm not sure that's necessary in the sense that there's certainly a lot of leaders that are not predatory, that are also not developmental, perhaps because interest groups capture them. Mm-hmm. Secondly, I think there's a lot of instances of predation leading to economic development. If you think of Manifest Destiny and wiping out Native Indians in the United States. And I bring that point up because, I mean, a lot of Asa Mogul's work on Africa argues that secure property rights in the past have a lot to do with success today. But when you think about how those property rights were created, it was actually after periods of predation and wiping out indigenous groups. So, and the regions where you see more stagnation were where regional bosses or local traditional chiefs were actually co-opted and their property rights weren't challenged. So I think there's a substantive point to that. And finally, what are the drivers of these hybrid stories of success? I mean, for example, Charles Tilly would argue that threat in the past was why states collected taxes. What, is it just a leader's vision that he's going to monitor the performance of a bureaucracy, or is there something else or something deeper driving why those hybrid institutions are formed and created in the first place?
Okay, I'm going to stop it there for a moment because there's quite a lot there and I know that you'll want to have a chance to reflect. David, do you have any initial thoughts? And then we'll go out again.
To Sheila, the article is not about aid institutions, it's about institutions, aid. So you should be more satisfied. Yes, there is a comma between them. So the institutions of interest are economic institutions, political institutions. I'm not going to define development. One of the things we found convenient in the APP is to work with the concept of the under-provision of public goods, because that's the real sort of crux of what is wrong with development in Africa now. It isn't lack of economic growth anymore. It is the lack of the key public goods which make that economic growth developmental and poverty reducing. I think I'll leave the others to Tim, although.
We sent you the hard ones.
Yes, I'll only respond to one of Sheila's points, which is the idea that by marking out certain institutions as being potentially underutilised, you then create problems, for instance, by, encouraging an influx of donor aid to target those institutions. And I agree that that is a problem, and I do think that we still have some thinking to do about the implications of this research for aid modalities. On the second point about faith-based healthcare, actually I wasn't suggesting that people seek out faith-based providers because of their own spirituality. I was suggesting that spiritual reasons are in part responsible for better staff performance within faith-based organisations. But I agree that that there are many grains, and that a multi-grain approach, just like a multi-grain cereal, is usually to be preferred. Again, I'm not going to define development. I'll refer to this public goods response. But I think that Seretse Khama in Botswana was to some extent the archetypal leader who went with the grain. He built on indigenous institutions like the Hokla. He had a constrained form of democracy. He himself was from a royal lineage, and he very much appropriated for himself the accoutrements of royal power, and was thought of as a kind of a king by Botswanans. So yes, I think that Botswana is very much sort of neo-traditional, going with the grain development. It's not a typical liberal democracy by any means. As to the dichotomy between predation and development, I accept your point in the way that you've formulated it. I think that from the point of view of the APP, and especially business and politics, if you come to the talk this afternoon, we have a distinction between long horizon and short horizon rent seeking, which I think solves some of the problems around forms of primitive accumulation or predation which lead to growth and those which don't lead to growth. And then finally on what are the drivers of hybrid success. So from the same gentleman. Yes, I think that threat perceptions are part of the story. I also think that the external incentive structure, the presence or absence of donor instance, is also a part of the story. But there may be other dimensions to it which we're not yet aware of and which we haven't yet fully thought through. So.
Great, thank you. Sue, is there anything in there that you want to reflect on? Okay, I'll take it out again. Alan's the next one over there. And you'll let me know if anything comes via the web, Liam, won't you?
Thank you. My name's Alan Hudson. I work for DFID in the Politics and State team in Policy Division. Couple of quick questions. Firstly, David, you won't be surprised to know, David, from our other interactions, that you talked about how external actors might nudge things along. I am always keen on these occasions to nudge you along to say a bit more about what that might actually mean. Secondly, kind of related to that, David, I was interested that you talk about the kind of the importance of country ownership. And this is a plug for an earlier edition of the DPR, there was an excellent article by Jörg Faust in an earlier edition of the DPR, which basically talks about country ownership as being kind of mythical and not real. So in a way, there could be a slight tension between the Faust article and what you were saying, David. But I guess you resolve that tension by being interested in the processes through which country ownership comes about. And my question for you, David, then would be, what role do you think domestic accountability has in helping in the emergence of country ownership? Then, finally for Sue, really, I was very pleased that Sue brought out a bit more some of the possible implications for donors. But it seems to me that there is a different conclusion that one could reach. So starting from the point that donors have little leverage over domestic politics in developing countries, and the point that context is key and blueprints won't work, and that donors, however much political analysis they do, won't really understand the context, and also questions of legitimacy, maybe the only thing that donors should do is kind of try to nurture an environment of transparency and accountability out of which local solutions can emerge. That would be an alternative reading of things. And it seems to me there could be some quite strong links between that sort of take and the idea of anchoring things in local realities. And that's a kind of way of thinking that is coming out a bit in some of Diffid's work on empowerment and accountability.
Okay, very good, thanks. And then I'm going to... Lenny, do you have something? Okay, Lenny at the front, and then I'm coming over to you.
I'm Lenny Wild from ODI. Just a quick reflection. While I appreciate, David, that you've already emphasised the comma between aid and institutions, I just wanted to pick up a bit, perhaps on the points that Sheila was making and on the points I think Sue made very well about what are the implications coming out of this kind of research. Because it seems to me that Sue in particular was very careful to talk about kind of external actors rather than solely donor agencies. And there's a danger that we can get a bit caught up in some of these discussions about a rather narrow focus on aid and donor agencies, whereas some of the implications that I think Sue pulls out are broader than that. They're on working more at the international level to tackle incentives. They're perhaps thinking within donor countries about other parts of government and how they work more effectively together. It seems to me there's a number of ways in which this is actually part of the kind of beyond aid agenda. and to what extent are you kind of thinking in that way as well?
Great, thank you. We sweep over, and I'm going over here now because I've Warren there, and then Alina.
Jenny Borden. I'd like to ask Tim whether we forget gender issues in going with the grades. And to Sue, I'd like to ask her what she thinks the new role of civil society should be, having been pushed in against people's better judgment maybe 10, 15 years ago, having been pushed into playing this accountability role. You know, nothing would get funded unless it was actually civil society trying to provide accountability. You're now saying that, you know, this has been not such a good thing. So what is the role? Do they just wither away?
Finally, Alina, and then I'll take another round at the end. I want to.
Alina Rocha-Menocal from ODI. I wanted to ask both David and Tim if you have examples of findings from the APP research on how and whether ethnicity has been successfully used to harness development, because one of the criticisms can be, and I don't know if this is what Tim was referring to, but one has to ask development for whom and at what cost. And I wonder where these findings fall into that question. And then the other question that I had more or less echoes a little bit of what Jonathan Dijon was saying, which refers to these vertical performance disciplines. And I guess the puzzle there is really, how do you get to that in the first place? Why is it that some leaders, agree to have technocratic visions and agree to have these accountability mechanisms that promote development? And I'm wondering if in your research you have found that from regime to regime in a particular country, these things stayed over time, or it was killed off as soon as the particular leader in charge left or was deposed or what have you.
Brilliant, okay. I'm going to ask you all to reflect on some of those questions before we go out for a final round. Sue, there was this particular one to you, since you didn't speak in the last round. Can I get you to
There were
reflect
two,
on that?
actually.
There were two,
Alan's,
yeah.
and then there was Jenny Borden's.
Yes.
Alan says, if donors have little leverage and context is key and donors don't understand it anyway and they lack legitimacy. You said, Alan, perhaps the only things that they should do is to nurture an environment of transparency and accountability, beside which I wrote how, ? What I do think, and the bit of the agenda that I still believe in quite strongly, is what goes under the shorthand of global drivers. I think that there are things that OECD governments can do to limit either the damage that governments and businesses and the damaging impact of their behaviour on poor countries, and I think there are sometimes ways of harnessing market power and improvements in global regulation and so on that could actually be quite powerful but indirect. I don't think they're at all simple. I think some of the mechanisms that are out there are open to capture, but I do think that's so that would be a different take, if you like, on saying what we ought to be doing is looking for ways of nurturing a more conducive environment. But I wouldn't know how to do it through encouraging transparency and accountability. I think that reopens the problems. At least if you have in mind to do that by way of any kind of direct interventions. And then, if you're, I'm not really saying a new role for civil society. I think I'm saying a new way of thinking about civil society. I mean, it seems to me that part of the problem with the industry that's grown up is that in response what has been done is to create a whole lot of organisations that a lot of the time are just businesses, actually. And going back to the starting point for this discussion and thinking about, what would building on what's there mean, I think it would mean, for one thing, looking at a much broader range of non-state actors and looking at very much at the dynamics between those different organisations and public organisations, the state society dynamics that are around there, opportunities that there might be maybe to nudge more effective collective action. But I absolutely wouldn't be in there trying to sort of construct civil society.
Thank you. David, there were two particular questions, one from Alan, one from Lenny. Do you want to take those?
Yep. The article by Jörg Faust, which is about sort of ownership and democratization, is actually one of the best things we've published in this area in recent times. It's not in the reprint because it's quite recent. It was just an article from last year. I mean, it's primarily about the disadvantages of linking ownership with democratization, as I read it. How might donors help nudge things along? I mean, I like the phrase nurturing an environment favourable to, but I think we should stop and take out the transparency and accountability bit and start thinking more creatively about what kind of what the environment ought to be facilitating, enabling, and so forth. And I think the right concepts for this are the kinds of ones that Tim was setting out from our research. It's about leaving room for people to solve collective action problems that they face without the obligation to adopt some sort of imported international template for the way they do it. It's about leaving space for people to do things. And I think this is the answer to the concern that Sheila Page has, that what we're going to be end up advocating is that donor money starts sort of putting its hands on various informal institutions and trying to use them. That's not what we're going to end up recommending. It's all about backing off, in fact, and leaving space for creativity in the institutional sphere to play a role. To Lenny, the idea of reforming global relationships and institutions in ways that would remove some of the perverse incentives on country leaders, that's, I think, a very important agenda, but I don't think it's the only thing that is of interest. And I think getting donors based in countries to behave better, to behave the way they want to behave, rather than the way they are constrained to behave by their bosses, also has some potential. And those potentials become more apparent, I think, as you get below the national level and start thinking about particular sectors, particular issues, and very localized development, like, for example, the management of health services in a densely populated urban centre in Malawi, which is one of the sources of the work that Tim was referring to. There's much more scope for intelligent facilitation of change processes once you get down below the national level. And if it's well informed, it can produce good results. We know that.
Okay, great. Tim, a couple of reflections before we...
Yeah, okay. I mean, the first biting question was, do we just forget about gender issues? And my answer to that is no, but it's also that, I mean, from my point of view at least, going with the grain is not a normative position, it's a research agenda. It's an attempt to find out which are the institutions which are providing public goods more successfully in Africa. And once you've found out which those institutions are, then you can unpack their gender implications and see if there are trade-offs that can be made or that have to be made. And then maybe make a judgment as to whether or not they are desirable. But I think you can point to things like the Imihigo in Rwanda, where you have what really is a patriarchal institution, an oath of loyalty sworn by warriors to the king, which is nevertheless being used to stop women from dying in labour. And so although it's not specifically, it doesn't come from a gender perspective, this policy, nevertheless it's having a very positive impact on women's well-being. So I think you need to look at things in an open-minded way like that. That would be my response, and not prejudge institutions on the basis of where women appear to stand within them. From Alina, are there successful examples of ethnicity being harnessed for development? I would say not too many, but that's partly because of some fierce debates we had within APP, which eventuated in us choosing mostly multi-ethnic field sites for our research. So I think that most of our examples are of ethnicity being successfully managed rather than harnessed, with perhaps one or two small exceptions. And then the other question about vision and leaders. Yeah, in the business and politics research, we do find that the vision, the orientation of a regime with respect to development can change quite dramatically when a new leader comes in. I mean, a typical example would be the shift from Kenyatta to Moi in Kenya. And how do you explain that? I mean, it's partly to do with personal proclivities, I think, but it's also partly to do with the nature of Kenyatta's political support base and the nature of Moi's political support base, and whether a growth-oriented strategy or a more redistributive strategy was going to be appropriate to, you know, shoring up and consolidating that base. So I think that the drivers of these processes are often to be found, as I mentioned earlier, in external arrangements, senses of internal and external threat, and the nature of political settlements that are peculiar to individual countries and individual regimes.
Okay, great. I'm going to abuse my position as chair just for one moment before I take a few more questions, and then we can move towards the end of the session. I mean, what I've been hearing is very interesting, but it seemingly slightly polarised discussion about, on the one hand, the discussion around global drivers, which Sue puts on, which I have instinctively a lot of support to, the need to address some of these global drivers which essentially undermine capacities, competencies and so forth at local levels and undermine public authority. The other hand, we've got quite a lot of focus in this work on there being increased prospects for facilitating change subnationally and essentially locally. So we have global and we have local. What then in this kind of approach is the required competency of national level institutions? What is left, in a sense? What are we saying about those competencies that are then needed to support this process of delivering public goods in an effective and sustained manner? And that's something I'm still trying to wrestle with in my mind, as this picture seems to slightly polarise around those two storylines. Okay, I have a few more questions in this group here. I have Tony first. Yeah, and then I'm going to move to wrap up.
Tony Killick.
Could you speak into the mic, Tony? Yeah.
Tony Killick, an associate of ODI. I'm interested in the implications of the discussion for aid policy, but for other aspects of policy from the industrial world towards the developing world. I hear a lot about going with the grain, leaving space, harnessing tradition. And my question, I guess, would be, bearing in mind David's important distinction between policy as what is done rather than policy as what is said, is it actually possible to imagine in the real world that aid donor agencies and other policy makers in the industrial world who impinge upon developing countries could actually accommodate that way of looking at things? Isn't it really going against their grain, and it particularly the political imperatives, that they could possibly adopt such an attitude?
Interesting point, thank you. So, comment here, gentleman with the glasses at the end, and then
Hi,
one at the back.
Henry Kippen from 2020 Public Services Trust over at the RSA, and I had a reflection rather than a question, a quick one, about the difference between the tentative conclusions you draw and the journey to policy, which, as you say, is a kind of a slightly fractured one and one that needs to be made very carefully. And we do work in and around UK public services, and a lot of the same insights about how you work with the grain, how you understand how communities live, where the hubs are, what kind of new behavioural approaches might be. A lot of the same kind of thinking is being employed, but the journey to policy is staggeringly quick. So all of a sudden you've got a big society, a trust in markets that wasn't there before. You've got a behavioural science unit in the Cabinet Office. It's a reflection really just on the fact that you guys have come to these conclusions over a 3-year process and been very measured about how you think they could be applied. Contrast that with what's happening in government at the moment. It's interesting, is all I'm saying.
It's a luxury, believe me. At the end here, and then at the back.
Hi, Christina Ashton. I'm a postgrad at UCL. My question was to Tim about the vertical performance discipline. You mentioned retaining networks of patronism and clientelism in administration. But my question is, how then do you keep the networks accountable for the public good? Doesn't that become a pursuit of the group goal then?
Okay, just behind you at the back there, and then I'm closing that so we can wrap up.
Thank you very much. My name is Masumi Owa from Warwick University. I agree with David that you said that donors need to back off and leave space. As you mentioned in your presentation, that donors has been changing their policies very fastly and fashionably over last decades or more than that. And also I agree with Alison saying that donors has to be very patient because it takes time. From these findings, I understand that it takes time for donors to understand the reality on the ground, and at the same time, it takes time for the developing countries to build capacity and build the right institutions in place. But at the same time, when we look at the practice of donors, incentives of donors, these are not in line with what we think that there should be. And my question is how, in detail, we can change the incentives of the donors from where they have to show the result towards the internationally agreed policies, such as Paris Declaration, to the situation where they can humbly understand the reality on the ground.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Liam, there's nothing come through the web. Okay, great. Very small one, Lisa, because I really want to. I need you to have a mic because we're being streamed. So
Lisa Denny from ODI. I had a question for Tim. I wonder if there is a danger in strengthening institutions like chieftaincy systems, for example, because while I agree that they are a large provider of public services, they often provide these services in a highly sort of inequitable manner. And I think that inequality then can create grievances that in its worst form can result in conflict. And I think this is what most people would say has happened in Sierra Leone. So I wonder if the going with the grain argument sort of underplays the importance of inequality. And I think this also sort of got picked up in what David was just saying about leaving space for people. Now, leaving space for people, I think, often means leaving space for elites, so that these things aren't really as open and democratic as perhaps is sort of being suggested.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for those comments and questions. This is the sort of final round. David, can you start off?
Yeah, I mean, we usually say this up front, and but we need to say it now. I mean, the grain metaphor has lots of limitations, and we've come across many of them already. But it's still reasonably expressive of a certain overall ambition to build on what exists rather than invent everything from scratch on the basis of general abstract ideas and principles. I mean, I think the answer to your question, Alison, about what are the national level institutions, that is, I mean, that's what we're working on in the business politics thing. And so the idea that there are there are degrees of neo-patrimonialism with different developmental implications. I mean, I think John is right that this is not just a dichotomy between predatoriness and developmentalness, because actually what we're saying is that there are certain kinds of predation which are developmental. Tony, who also has an article reprinted in this collection, Tony Killick, can we really imagine that under the political imperatives that ministers currently have, they would come in anywhere near adopting the kinds of ideas we're talking about here? It is a real challenge, but on the other hand, some of those political imperatives are of relatively recent origin. I mean, it's only since 1989 that development organizations have routinely committed themselves to promoting democratization as the means of achieving development. Now, that's a lot to reverse, but it's not the case that development organizations have always been addicted to the full panoply of democratic rights that they're committed to these days. So they certainly were not when USAID was the main donor in Northeast Asia. And I had another related point about that. Oh, yes. I mean, some of the kinds of facilitation work that I'm talking about at the sort of sector and subsector levels, which I think is very well illustrated by some of the work that DFID was doing in Latin America until recently, is the sort of thing you can do when you have a presence in the country, have good locally recruited staff, are very well connected, and don't have a huge budget to disburse. So again, it's something that DFID has shown in the past, or DFID ODA has shown in the past, that it can do. And to this extent, I mean, maybe what we're talking about is unlearning some of the headway that's been made in moving towards big bucks budget support as the principal modality. Yeah, I mean, Henry Kippin's point about the speed of policy change in British government, I mean, maybe it should give us hope, actually. That actually, if the right document arrives on the right desk at the right time, you know, maybe we'll get more uptake more quickly than we're imagining. Masumi's questions, I mean, did relate to the sort of interface between what we're finding here and what are taken as the sort of goals of better aid practice in the current environment. I'm not sure how I have an answer to those questions, but certainly the way in which we discuss these findings in dialogue with donors needs to be relating to the Paris Declaration principles, the idea of country ownership, and all of those other things. I'm not sure that our formula for backing off and leaving more space and being more patient is exactly the one that has been promoted in recent times by the Japanese agencies. We may have some points of contact with that agenda, but I don't think we're quite on the same wavelength.
Slightly cryptic, but maybe we could pursue that. Sue, do you have any last?
Well, I think David said probably what there is to be said in reply to Tony's comment. Only I was reminded of what Ed Murrow, the US broadcaster, apparently used to say in reply to any letters that came in, you know, criticism or whatever from viewers. He would reply by saying, "Dear sir or madam, you may well be right." And I think you may well be right. I mean, just to put the kind of counter argument, what I do see is, compared with 10 years ago, a critical mass of people who are saying some of the things that have been said today, and the scope for more honest debate. I think that I really think there is scope for more honest debate, including with British taxpayers. So I wouldn't exclude the possibility, and because that external narrative is actually increasingly not credible, and at some stage people are surely intelligent people are going to start recognising that. So maybe some grounds for hope.
Great, thank you. Tim, last reflections.
Yes, this question about when you have patron-client networks as the basis for top-down performance disciplines, how do you ensure accountability for the public good? I'm not sure how to answer that for the future, but I would say that if you look at the past history, those countries which had these successful developmental patrimonial regimes did not have strong societal accountability in that sense. However, what they did have was a measure of inclusivity, so that the benefits from growth were reasonably widely distributed. They weren't equitably distributed. There was favoritism for some ethnic groups over others, but no significant ethnic groups were cut out, because if you did cut out a significant ethnic group, then you risk regime overthrow or insurgency or something like that. So to some extent there's a sort of self-limiting constraint on leaders who choose this path. And then just responding to Lisa's point, yeah, I think it's important to get away from the idea that we're saying that tradition is good, or those institutions which are thought to be traditional are necessarily good. I mean, I'm sure you know about the history of chieftaincy in Sierra Leone is one of massive political interference from both the colonial and post-colonial powers, which has very often weakened their legitimacy at a local level. So I think that to some extent that was a driver of the conflict in Sierra Leone, and the decision to channel increase resources through chiefs wasn't necessarily a good one, at least not in all places. So it's about trying to find the institutions which really do have legitimacy on the ground. However, I would also simply say about that one shouldn't imagine that democratically decentralized local government produces results which are any more equitable, even though it's supposed to.
Great. Well, I want to thank you all very, very much indeed. I think it's been an incredibly rich and at times maybe even slightly uncomfortable discussion, but I think this is exactly where the contribution both of this volume and also the output of the Africa Power Politics Programme and to some extent the work of the Centre for Future State is taking us, and it's been a fantastic, I think, churning through some of that evidence. I would urge you to, if you want to find out more, to go and have a look at the sources of each of those areas of work. I want to thank David, Tim and Sue very much indeed for a very fascinating debate. Thank you.